My name is Monk Rowe, and we are filming in New York for the Hamilton College Jazz Archive. I'm quite pleased to have Maria Schneider with me this afternoon. And I know you have been working both ends of your life quite busy last few days.
Yeah, with the performance of my orchestra and panels, and then just seeing everybody that you've ever met in school or working overseas or in the States and from schools and things. So it's pretty crazy here.
This Jazz Educators Conference is pretty astounding, actually, when you think of how far it's come in the last few years.
Yeah, it's gotten bigger and bigger. I just noticed the catalog gets thicker, you know.
You're one of the few people I talked to who really went all the way through with your education in music, from through graduate work. And I'm not sure how to ask this question, but I'll try. In your writing, how much of it is attributable to your education, and how much of it is inherent in you?
That's an interesting question. I think the biggest thing that school gives you, or gave me, I'll talk about me, the biggest thing that school gave me was an opportunity to focus on my music without the distractions of the other things in life. You know, this concentration of going to classes, and just your mind is always in that period of your life where I think those are really big years, you know, when you're from 18 to maybe 24, 25, you can really absorb a lot of information, and I think the biggest thing was just the concentration of thinking about music all the time, because I was in school, and being around other musicians and having ensembles available to write for. I think that was the most important part of it. I think that the most important teachers I had were teachers that guided but didn't tell me what to do. And, you know, as far as jazz composition goes, when I did my undergrad at the University of Minnesota, there was no jazz program at that school. I also didn't have a jazz high school band or anything like that. I grew up a matter of fact, I'm from Minnesota, a very small town, and there was only one person in Windham that really knew anything about jazz, but she was an extraordinary stride player. This is kind of going off your question, but it kind of leads up, because my education really started with her. And as I was learning classical pieces, she taught me how to play in this old stride style. So we were learning standards, and I would come up with my own piano arrangements of them, basically with a little bit of improvisation. And I learned to play out of a fake book. The thing is, she didn't tell me anything about the development of jazz. So by the time, and there was no record store. The only records I had were old Ellington records from the 30s, Teddy Wilson, Artie Shaw. I didn't have any modern jazz records. So, and public TV and public radio wasn't so big back then. I had a lot of classical music, but I was really, I always felt sad, because I felt that I grew up in the wrong era, that if I had grown up when Mrs. Butler did, because she had come from Chicago, and she only moved to Windham because her son and her husband had both died within a month of each other. Her only family left was in Windham, so that's the only reason there was this genius personality in Windham. But I thought that jazz had died, and I felt really sad that I grew up in the wrong era, because I wanted to be part of that. So by the time I went to college for music, I thought, well, maybe I'll study composition. But I felt weird in the classical world, because the classical world in the universities, especially, even more so at that time, tonality was something that, you know, if you wrote something that was tonal, you were just shunned.
Is that right?
Oh,
that's really weird.
It's absolutely true. And I remember I wrote a piece for two pianos that was on a sort of a composer forum concert at the school or whatever. And I remember people looking at each other, because everybody was writing sort of atonal music, and this thing was very tonal and romantic. And I remember seeing two older composers looking at each other and giggling. And I remember feeling, I just don't have a place in this world, in this music. And then I went to, two things happened at once. I went to a Bob Hope show, of all things, and they were backed up by a big band from the college. This is right when I started school, and I said, oh my God, there's a big band, and I saw this kid playing drums and people improvising a little bit, and I was like, oh my God, I had no idea this sort of thing existed. And then this guy who lived in the dorm down the hall from me, he heard me playing some old Ellington album, and he said, do you like jazz? And I said, yeah, you know what that is? And he said, well, as it turned out, I didn't know what it was. He knew what it was. He brought me all these records. He brought me Herbie Hancock Headhunters. He brought me Coltrane, McCoy Tyner. I'd never heard a piano player play without a root before. So suddenly I heard all this modern jazz, and I tell you, I was like in tears, because it was like, oh my God, the dream came true that this music had evolved and I could be part of it. And so immediately I just started trying to absorb everything I could. And I got through with that classical degree as quickly as I could, so that my last year of school, all I did was work on my own study. I studied with Manfredo Fest, who was a Brazilian pianist that lived in Minneapolis. He was blind, but he taught me all our lessons. We just transcribed Bill Evans by ear, and it was amazing. And then I tried to write a few things for the big band, and I learned on my own. And I learned from friends that I was in school with that were playing. There was a guy named Dave Sletton, who sadly just died, a young guy. But he and I would get together, and we'd go to our Manfredo lessons together and listen to each other's lessons. And it was, but that was more you know, so you could say, okay, I came through a college, but my education in jazz came from this support of friends and just out of a love of music and listening to things all the time. I heard this record. Did you hear that? I transcribed this. Let me share it with you. That was the value of school. And then when I wanted to go on and study further, then I applied to go to Eastman for grad school. And Rayburn Wright, who also has since passed away, sadly, he wrote me a letter back, and he said, Maria, he said, we can't accept you. You don't, he said, but I really feel like you have talent. He said, I really recognize that, but you don't have any experience. So why don't you come out to our summer session? At that time, they had this big arrangers holiday, which was quite famous at the time, and arrangers came from all over the country. They put together a big band, studio orchestra, and you wrote your ass off for 3 weeks, and then they would play your music and critique it. So I worked my butt off to impress Ray and to learn, you know, and I wrote my first studio orchestra piece, and I quickly caught up. And I hadn't gotten into Eastman, but I went to University of Miami for a semester. I went around all these students that were doing so many modern things, and they were so great, and the band was so fantastic, and you know, they played my music, they recorded a couple things. I mean, I was just like, I went from like here to here, you know, overnight, and then Eastman then allowed me to get in, and I wanted to go to Eastman because they had people like Bill Dobbins, who really taught jazz from the historical point of view, and I was missing everything from swing until, you know, today. And I really needed the roots of things, and so Bill Dobbins, you know, we'd go through Charlie Parker solos note for note and analyze everything, and I needed that because I was missing a lot. But as far as my own voice, I found that nobody helped me with that.
You're really self-motivated.
Self-motivated, and also because I didn't have anybody really over my shoulder in those beginning stages where I was experimenting, I came up with my own unorthodox ways of doing things that I never dropped. And I remember Rayburn Wright in class, he used to pull out my things as an example and say, Maria broke every rule I taught you last week here, but it works, and this is why. And so that was nice. You know, not always was it good, but every once in a while he would say that, and I appreciated that he recognized that and allowed me to grow in those kind of unorthodox ways.
Wow. Did you have a supportive family in this kind of decision?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank God. I remember hearing my parents argue one night that my father's more practical than it's hard to say, but my mother really supported us in the arts. When I had two sisters, one is a painter, now she's an architect. The other one did a lot of Shakespearean acting and writing. Now she became a lawyer. Everybody became slightly more practical. and I did music, and I remember my father at one point just panicked that his daughters were theater, art, and music, and it's your fault. You are the one who bought them all the books and the records and the paintings, you know, or whatever. But they're always supportive, and you know, they don't always understand everything I do. Sometimes my mother says, "I want to hear something I can sing in the shower," you know, and but they were supportive.
Right. Wow. That was a great answer, actually.
Well, you see, that's what I mean. You just can't shut me up once you so.
Well, when you get a commission to write, I was going to skip to this question because after hearing some of your work the other night, I'm wondering if you get a commission to write something, do people usually give you guidelines like, we are looking for this kind of thing? And if they don't, where does your initial inspiration come from?
Okay, well, the first thing is, actually, I don't like getting commissions. I know every composer likes commissions, and because it means you're being paid to write. But I put myself through a psychological trip a little bit when I get a commission. Luckily, people don't say to me, I'd like you to do something that's kind of this or that. If they do, forget it. It's over. I can't, you know. I have had people commission me to write an arrangement of something. For instance, Love Theme from Spartacus, the Danish Radio Orchestra, he came to me. But then he didn't tell me how to do it. I knew I was doing that piece for Toots the Elements. So I took the elements of that song that I loved and I developed them, and the elements of that song which I didn't love, I skirted my way around, you know. But so generally, you know, the thing that I have a problem with is if somebody comes to me and says, I want a drum feature for me, or I want a piece that features me on flugelhorn. I'm not the kind of writer who can look at a player and say, this person technically can do this and this and this, and I want to showcase it. For me, music is something that has to be really personal. I have to go back into childhood memories, kind of feelings. I have to really transport myself into an experience to feel motivated to write. Because when I was a child and doing music, I didn't learn music because because I was in school and thought music would be an interesting thing to do, or somebody pushed me to do it. My early motivation to do music all came from me. You know, when that woman, Mrs. Butler, moved to Wyndham, I was 5 years old, and my parents invited her to come up to our house for dinner, and after dinner, she sat down at the piano and played. And I remember she played like this classical thing, actually something I'd recognized from my mother's records. And then she started playing stride jazz, and I immediately could feel that there was something in that wasn't the same as the other thing. I remember recognizing somehow the difference between pop and classical at that moment. But the personality that came through her, she had red hair, she was flamboyant, she was eccentric, she wore bright green muumuus and purple slippers, and you know, she was just intense, and the intensity came through the music. She was like Dorothy Donegan, and when she would play, she'd be laughing and accidentally go off the end of the piano, almost Victor Borge style. But such technique, but soul, you know? And that thing for me was just so incredibly important in the music. And so when I went into my own music and I started playing, for me it was like fantasy. You know, I would play something and I would shut my eyes. I could play for hours. And I used to fantasize when I'd play piano. I'd fantasize that there were talent scouts from cars that would drive past Wyndham, because Wyndham was in the sticks. It was nowhere. And my dream was like to go to New York someday, even though I had no idea what New York was, you know. Maybe I psychically kind of knew what might come someday. So I used to fantasize that there were talent scouts and cars that had machinery that could hear inside of homes and that they were listening to me. So I was always full of fantasy in my music. And you know, when you're a child, you experience disappointment for the first time, sadness, romantic love maybe, intensity, fear. All the emotions you have are the most intense in your childhood because that's the first experience you have. so many things touch you then. So I always go back to that. Sometimes I'm inspired by a painting, the textures, the colors, the lines that touch me somewhere. You know, music is, for me, it's the beauty in music is not necessarily music. It's the thing that music for me is like a sound manifestation of something much deeper. Or it's I'm trying to get some feeling inside me out, or some kind of experience, or some kind of vibration, something, and codify it in sound to transport other people to that same place. So I'm not just trying to create interesting sound, I'm trying to transport an experience through music.
I can hear it when
Oh,
you're in your
that's
pieces, you know. And I was interested to hear the other night that your pieces don't seem to usually start with one groove and keep it all the way. That they have sections, and things happen to the time, and things happen to the emotion within them.
Yeah, you know, it's something I started to realize about jazz, because I have to say I'm really disappointed in a lot of jazz I hear. Not that I listen and say I'm disappointed, but I just lose interest pretty quickly. And I think that, you know, jazz at one time was music that it just evolved. Later it was named jazz, and then everybody goes back and analyzes how it came into being or whatever. But it was something that came up spontaneously from something very deep and cultural and human and personal and, you know, sociological. Everything came together. And, you know, for me, you know, now what happens is when people are, say, they're writing music, they have this template of how music has been behind them. You know, like, okay, it's jazz. That means has rhythm section, probably drum set. It means that there's a bass line. It means that there's something comping. It means that there's a solo section. It means that there's a tune, and then that tune is going to be used for improvisation, and then there's going to be a development. And without even thinking about it, when you sit down to compose, it's very easy to have this grid. Boom, it's planted in the back of your head, and then you end up, okay, maybe you fill in the blanks with a different melody, a different set of chord changes that are slightly different, a few little innovations, but it's still stuck in this grid that, you know, it's like you have in the back of your head. And so for me, what I try to do is make my music about experience and throw away that grid. And what I try to do is say, okay, I have this orchestra. This is a chamber group. In this group, I have 13 wind instruments. And I have much more, because each of the saxophone players can play flute. They can play clarinet. Now I have a guy who can play oboe and English horn. I have all these mutes available for trombones. I have all these flugel and mutes available for the trumpet. I have lots of different ways of playing the piano that could be available. The strings, everything. The bass can be arco, it can be pizzicato. The drummer can be more like a percussion player. I have the element of space. You know, I can use just a piano and a flute. I don't have to use the whole band, saxes versus the trumpets, and do it in this same way. And so if you can just release yourself, and the beauty of having a jazz group is that you have all these people that understand this art of improvisation and have a basis and a history to put that language into something logical, but they're all open-minded enough to not necessarily do that in a style that comes from the 1940s or 30s or whatever, but they all, you know, Scott Robinson, he's into C melody saxophone, and he's into all sorts of old style things, but he also loves Sun Ra, and he has such a wide world that's coming, you know, and then I have that coming through all the different musicians. So I try to just open myself up and say, I want to create something unlabeled, you know, no grid, no styles, no nothing coming through me. Of course, you can't avoid it. I've listened to a lot of Gil Evans, I've listened to a lot of Ravel, I've listened to a lot of Brookmeyer. All those things are here, but try to really be conscious of getting rid of this thing, you know, and the score paper with 8 bars.
Yes.
I never write with barred paper. I put up a huge piece of score paper with 1,000 tiny staves with no bar lines. And I even try to get away from looking at the stave. I stand up and I dance and I move around and I sing, and sometimes I'll run a tape recorder while I'm doing it, and then I go to the piano and I try to figure out what the hell I'm doing, because the minute I'm thinking about music, it becomes music. I want the music to be that other thing, and then I codify it in notes, in little black dots and lines, you know, to try to translate it. Does it make sense?
It does. It's wonderful to hear. It's
Yeah.
really innovative, I think. I know what you mean. Like, you know, you get used to putting a shout chorus 3/4 of the way through, and you know,
Oh, yeah,
what's
it's-
going to happen at the solo, put a background after the solo.
Or that there even is a shout chorus, you know, it's like, what is a shout chorus and why? Does it, you know, boy, hasn't there been music written for centuries and in different cultures and nobody had a shout chorus? Why in jazz do we always have to have a goddamn shout chorus, you know? That's kind of how I feel, you know, sometimes when I hear large ensemble jazz music, you know? So, you know, if you think about music, just people, like I went to Brazil. You know that probably because I talked about that hang gliding piece, but I went to Brazil, and one of the powerful things in Brazil was that one of the powerful things in Brazil was that in Brazil, music feels just synonymous with life. Everybody makes music part of their life. Music isn't something you go to the conservatory for, that they have a building for, and that they get funding for.
Yeah.
Music is something that makes life tolerable, you know, that it's a valve for releasing and creating beauty out of something that's sometimes miserable or sometimes beautiful or whatever, but it's an expression that everybody uses. They don't know what bar lines are and what a 4-bar phrase is. They sing in a phrase that they feel. And all the other stuff of writing it down and analyzing it is just a means to kind of put that into place. But music is the most natural thing in the world, and sometimes I think in school we make it the most complex thing in the world, and it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be, you know, to me music should speak. Actually, it was Wayne Shorter. I met Wayne Shorter when I was in Brazil, and he said that Miles used to say he liked music that doesn't sound like music, and I was like, hallelujah, me too, you know.
Wow.